Hello, everyone. I'm Miheer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of LiveLike. I'm excited to have you all on this special live webinar that I'm hosting with Samuel Westberg, who's my co-founder and chief revenue officer. We're super excited to have Peter Hutton join us. Obviously, I think Peter's resume speaks for itself, but I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit later. But the conversation today over the next 30 to 40 minutes is about the business case for gamification and fan engagement. We're trying to keep the conversation lighthearted and conversational, and bring some real world perspectives to the discussion. And we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments and we'll get to everything that we can.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Peter, for joining us. Excited to have you here with us. To start off, maybe it'll be good for you to just introduce yourself for those who may not know you, but that would be surprising.
Well, basically, I have sort of 2 points of my history, right? The first sort of 30 years of my sports media career was all about the growth of pay TV. You know, I was really lucky to be there at the start of Sky as a presenter and a commentator. Went to India for IMG, where we saw the explosion in value in Indian cricket as we played off ESPN and the News Corporation. Started a sports channel in Dubai in 2002 called 10 Sports, along with some good friends, and that went well. We sold it in 2010, went to work for Fox, and then went to work for Discovery to be CEO of Eurosport. So 30 years of working in the pay TV business. But one of the things that became more and more apparent to me was that I'd ridden pay TV because I thought it was such a better way of sports viewing, you know, from the dark years of sort of relying on terrestrials where you couldn't get access to anything. But then I realized that the way that viewer habits were changing and consumption was changing, that pay TV really wasn't the answer to a lot of the problems of the current desire for consumption. So switched, went to Meta, ran sports partnerships at Meta, had a great 5 years of genuinely learning from the people there more than anything else, and from the data that they were able to mine. And now I try and use that period of my life to sort of help sports organizations look towards how they change their publication and audience strategy. So sit on the board of a few different sports organizations, the Saudi Pro League, Professional Triathlon, Wembley Stadium, the Rugby League, and also work with sports tech companies such as Greenfly and YBVR. But really trying to sort of combine what I learned through 30 years of watching sport and being on pay TV with the sort of changes of consumption that I learned about from the time at Meta, and hopefully provide answers to questions which I think are worrying everybody in the sports industry, in terms of changing the way we publish, how do we react with an audience, how do we genuinely build a business?
Samuel, I know I didn't get a chance to introduce you properly. If you want to just talk about your background in the space as well.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think it's really valuable introducing myself after Peter, but high level, have always been on the tech startup side of things. Really excited to have this conversation to a bit compare the perspectives, being on the other side of the spectrum, obviously on our side, and building a technology to try to make sure that we offer solutions to those organizations in terms of bringing that next kind of period of engagement that they're heading into.
You know, one of the things, Peter, that I appreciate about you is I don't know anyone more, not just well-traveled, but someone who has worked across pretty much every geography in our industry. And the fact that you have been on every side of the table. I don't even think there are two sides. I think you've been on the seller side, on the buyer side, on the research and analytics side, on the social media side. And obviously you're bringing that experience to bear now across all of your current engagements. So from our perspective, what would be great for us and the audience to actually understand from your point of view is, you know, as you work with all of these investors and groups, how do you see yourself and the partners that you're working with, how do you guys look at fan data ownership as a, in terms of an asset for a sports organization today?
I think the first thing to say is it's complicated. There's no simple answer to the problems, because you're in a world where media consumption is so fractured. You still have a huge reliance on pay TV income for the majority of big leagues and teams. But you have a very different attitude for startups and for smaller teams and leagues. But I think capturing that fan data and having the flexibility to act on it is really important, and I think if there's one challenge that I sort of see all the time is that people sort of see their digital strategy and social media strategy as marketing and building their brand, but connecting that with actual monetization of audience, is the real challenge. And, there's clearly now a series of growth lines in terms of your revenue that can come through digital monetization, but it's not necessarily straightforward, publish and get paid for it. It's far more about understand what your audience wants and then be able to provide that to them in a way that they feel comfortable about consuming.
Actually, that's super interesting, right? Because there's always this conversation that we have with organizations, which is, oh, LiveLike can be a great cherry on the cake. And we want to tell them we want to be much more than a cherry on the cake, right? We want to work with you on delivering value. On the private equity side, how important is the reach compared to the first-party data capture?
Yeah, I think, where I live now in Silicon Valley, so much of it revolves around talking about private equity and how they're connecting with the sports industry, which is clearly a massive growth trend. And a lot of the conversations look really complicated from the outside, but when you get down to them, it's fundamentally about addressable audiences. How much do you know that audience? How much can you scale that audience, and how can you monetize that audience? And those are the sort of fundamental principles that underline a lot of private equity valuations. They want data points. They want proof points. Just saying, I've got a great sports product and I have 100,000 fans, really doesn't mean anything if you can't show how you can monetize those fans and how you can build an audience with it. You look at the sort of general trend of monetization, and everything used to rely on the big broadcast check that came out of the sky. And no one really understood how a broadcaster got to that number on the sports league side. It was just, it needs to be up. It's a commercial negotiation. It's based on competition. But increasingly now you've got that second line of monetization, which is how do you touch your fans? How do you transact with them in a way that it's authentic? You're building loyalty, you're building interest, you're making them care more about what you do. And then the byproducts of that is how do you then monetize that care through a variety of different products?
Do you think, actually, it's very interesting touch points across everything that you just said. One of the things that we come across a lot is, over the course of the past few years, we've been ahead of the curve a little bit, but I feel like the market is catching up now. It doesn't feel like we're evangelizing this topic anymore. It feels like people have started showing interest. But, it also there has to be a mindset shift in the boardroom as well. Because, when you go from the world of bundling to now suddenly everything is fragmented, and, you were collecting a big fat check every month without having to do too much yourself because the distributors were doing everything for you, to now trying to monetize this fan data, as much of an opportunity as it is. Do you think the ownership groups or people leading these organizations in the boardroom appreciate that there needs to be more work that has to go into it? Obviously, there are organizations such as ourselves and others in the space that are going to help with that, but it's not just sit back and let the income come to you. You have to actually work for it, work towards building a relationship, a direct relationship with the fans. And that has to trickle down eventually to people that are going to be servicing the space. Do you see that mindset shift happening in the conversations you're in the boardrooms?
It's clearly all at a very different pace, right? Certain organizations really get it and certain don't. And you'd think the ones that would get it would be the ones that don't get the big TV checks, but that's not necessarily true. You look at the work that the NBA and Premier League has done in the last year or so. They're clearly setting the pace by creating a series of activations where they're looking to enjoy and and understand their audiences better. You see the work that the Premier League is doing to build on an incredible fantasy product and turn that into a much wider engagement. It's hugely impressive. And I think, again, you look at the NBA and how they've understood that total audience isn't necessarily the people that watch them on linear channels. It's far more people who consume them across all sorts of different media, both legal and illegal. And I think that understanding from organizations like that still have really healthy media rights income, it's fascinating to see them begin to say, okay, we're doing really well, but we need to build secondary revenue lines as well. And it's a difficult conversation to have with the smaller teams and leagues, because they're first of all thinking, hang on, can we afford to pay for this? This is a new line item to build new skills, to acquire new software. And they're not always in a position to be able to make that extra spend. So I think part of the challenge that we have is sort of convincing people, look, this is not optional. This is something that you need to do if you're going to grow your audience, understand who your audience is, and then monetize that audience. You need a very clear philosophy behind that.
And that's interesting as well, because that's part of the conversations that we have with the organizations that we talk to. And I've seen small organizations do a great job, right? Because they haven't been as used as receiving this big check, as you say. So they've put a lot of effort in analyzing the data and creating marginal gains on every vertical, and by maybe having a facilitated decision process, because there's not that many people inside the organizations. Do you think for the moment gamification and loyalty is something that only is to be addressed by the big organizations, or do you think that opportunity is actually very much spread out? And the other thing I want to tie you to is your background on Meta, right? Can a small organization not rely on social media for gamification and engagement, and actually internalize it in a profitable way for themselves?
Look, I think I'll go to your last point first, which is, I still think Meta and the rest of the social media groups have a really important role to play, and particularly in terms of opening up a funnel of huge audience interest from a general audience. You need to be on the platforms where people are consuming. One of the bits of work that I really like seeing at Meta, and other people did the hard work, I'm not taking the credit for it, was the idea that you could help convert people who are Meta users and fans of your team or league, and convert them to your own platforms, where then the monetization options became more apparent. There are clearly some monetization options within that social media world, but there's far more fan data options as you migrate them to your own services as well. So again, I think it's part of a philosophy where you say, okay, I'm going to be present in all these ways, but I'm trying to bring people to do this, to act on this, to convert them in this way. And that's sort of the journey that you're on between social media and your own platforms.
One thing, this is something we've been always talking about, right? It's kind of funny because our genesis at LiveLike was always, and Peter, actually, funny thing is that we met you first when you were the CEO of Eurosport. I remember your first VR experience probably was when we came to your office and we put that headset on you. It was way back 2015, 2016. And then when you went over to Meta, obviously you started seeing from the other side of the table. One thing we would always tell our partners was, don't let social media control the fan relationship. Bring that owner relationship to your platform, whether it's in form of building communities or engaging them on your platforms, capturing that first party data, giving people a reason to actually register or sign in. Our whole thesis was, this is what the world of social media does. We can bring this to your platforms in the form of micro communities. And something that I've started seeing a shift, and it's no longer than the last 2 or 3 months. It's kind of crazy how everything sort of starts merging together. But most leagues that we're talking to right now are talking about how X has become unruly, a little bit difficult to manage, and they want to bring those communities onto their own platforms. For those fans, everyone may not come, but those fans that truly care about the game, the league, want to talk about the sport, they want to give them an avenue to speak on their own platforms. Obviously, big publishers and digital media companies like Bleacher Report or Yahoo, Sports Illustrated, they've been doing this for years. But now the leagues and the teams want to start taking control of that fan relationship as well. Are you still seeing any reticence or any gaps that you're like, you know what, this still needs to play out a little bit over the next 12 to 24 months where something needs to change?
I think you do see reticence because, sometimes you're turning around sort of oil tankers, aren't you? And they've committed to building their following on Facebook, and they trumpet it large when they're doing their sponsorship pitch that we have 14 million followers on Facebook and therefore we're worth X amount. And again, I'm not there to sort of decry the value of that. There is, and it's an important fan capture tool. I think the key bit in terms of how you then monetize that data is, how do you convert them? How do you bring them across? How do you give them experiences that are on your own platform? And that's a really important journey. One of the things that Meta did teach really well was an experiment that Melissa Lawton ran when she was there, where you were running, for example, live Spanish League games on Facebook in India, and you saw that people would stay 2-3 times longer if they'd engaged in a poll, if they'd taken a choice. You want people to care about the outcome, care about the result. So we were able to see really clear data there, how fan engagement through polling and taking a side really sort of allow people to stay for longer. And that's a real problem, right? People are not watching full long form games. You have to find a way of people caring, whether that be because they've got fantasy players involved or because they've got an emotional attachment to a player or a team. You need to build that to make people care enough to keep watching. And I think, that's something that teams and leagues need to lean into is how do you make people care more? That for me is like the fundamental problem, whether you're a broadcaster, a team or a league, potentially even a player. How do you make your fans or potential fans care enough that they become really loyal fans and they badge themselves as saying, I am a Derby County fan, I am a Yankees fan, I am a Ronaldo fan. And if you reach that point where they identify themselves with a sports brand, basically that's the point where you really want people to be at, because they will stay with you.
And can you help us start answering this question? Because you're on the board of the SPL and of PTO, right? Which are two very, very different organizations, right? One is looking to first get the reach on social media. So the funneling is going to take a little bit of time. PTO is very much D2C, so very, very much of a different approach. How do you start trying to implement that change in those organizations? Or how do you advise those organizations to start being the actors of that change?
I think, people respond to proper data and proper storytelling. You need good case studies. And I'm a big fan of learning across sports, right? So, using the example of the NBA to say they're doing that, we at the SPL could be thinking about this in a similar way. I don't like coming up with theories that are based on sort of, let's try it, but there's no sort of real history behind that. There are plenty of trials and experiments out there you can learn from. And I think one of the biggest dangers for a sports organization as you sort of struggle with the day-to-day battles is that you don't open up your eyes to see what is being done everywhere else. I'll use another great meta example that Jerry Newman and Ronan Joyce, when they were there, they ran a forum for the top football clubs across Europe where they would meet together and share sort of what they were each doing, because in a social media world, they're not really competitive to each other. They've all got the same challenges, but they can learn from what works. And I think going out there, finding good case studies, understanding, why someone has done something, see something cool, and then say, okay, can I find that person and ask them why they did it, how successful it was? That network within the sports world, I think, is really important. And just looking out beyond your team, your daily job, and going and finding real role models out there.
learning from other industries is the key point here. I've always said that LiveLike is sort of bringing best practices to the world of sports media, best practices from the world of gaming, from airlines. Just a couple of concepts. I mean, given that gamification and loyalty is the topic, we have seen, and we've all been consumers of this in our own lives, where concepts like, streaks, badges, virtual currency has worked in the gaming world, and it's all being brought into other worlds. I mean, Reddit and TikTok are introducing streaks at this point in time, right? Or if you think about loyalty mechanics, we all are frequent travelers, right? Whether that's whether you're a frequent flyer with an airline, or you have a hotel or hospitality brand of choice because you travel a lot. We all have been consumers or the recipients of those gamification and loyalty mechanics. Why do you think the sports industry hasn't done that just yet? Sports and media, I mean, it can be a broader topic. It doesn't have to be sports only, sports media entertainment. Like when these things work for everyone, do you think it's just a matter of not having the capability and not having the know-how and the anxiety to do something that you're not familiar with, or there's a fundamental issue?
I think there's a historic difference in that sports teams and leagues grew fandom absolutely organically, and it was a parent to child relationship. It was the territory that you came from, that you were exposed to your local team by a family member that had control of the remote control, and you watched what they watched. And that allowed the sports industry to have this natural sort of flow of, if you grew up in this city, you were going to support this team. And the problem now is that system is falling apart, in that those loyalties are not the same. You're not watching the same screen as your parents are watching. You're not consuming a newspaper in the way that they used to consume. So the realms of who you like, who you support, who you care about has widened so hugely that sport now can't rely on that generational, if I grow up in a city, I'm going to support this team. It simply isn't as relevant anymore. And in a fractured media landscape, that means that, your next generation of fans are going to consume their content in a really different way. And you need to be where they're consuming the content. And then you need to activate that into loyalty, because the loyalty can't be taken for granted in a way that maybe historically it could be taken for granted. And
especially in emerging leagues, which are building fandom.
Oh, look, if you're there's some really impressive emerging leagues out there, Grand Slam track, the Snow League, people like that, they have that problem of, there is no historical loyalty, but there is a massive curiosity in the sport, in the area, and in the stars of that sport. So how then do you convert those fundamental interest points, which give you a great start, into building a business, building loyalty, building people who care all over the world? And I think all over the world is the sort of final bit that I should have mentioned at the start, which is your fan base isn't in your city. Your fan base is everywhere. What Wrexham have done in the US is a slightly bizarre but perfect proof point of it, that with the right sort of hooks, you've suddenly got a fan base in the US for a club in the lower leagues of English football. And they've done it brilliantly, and now they're capturing the value of that with sponsorship deals with people like United Airlines sponsoring a team in North Wales. Logically that doesn't work, right? But because the fan base is so diverse and fits United's target demographics in the US, it's a sponsorship deal which happened.
It's fascinating, actually. I just wanted to say, go ahead.
Yeah, because I was going to say,
go for it.
And because people are participating and keep shooting questions, and there's one question that actually goes to you with regards to that here, which is coming from Eric, who asked, what are the most common questions or barriers you're hearing from your potential customers prior to adopting or considering implementing engagement solutions? And I think it was a good bridge to talk about the local, the international element, and the things that we're trying to solve for our clients.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's a good segue, because one of the things, I heard this from someone in English Premier League, and I have it's become like my mantra whenever I'm talking to everyone, which is, it's no longer about game day and local, it's everyday and global, and that rings true for even organizations with built-in local fandom, like the Premier League clubs, it's changing so drastically. You can monetize fans not just on local game days, right? It's always on 24/7 content. People are launching their own direct-to-consumer channels. They have their own YouTube subscription channels. Celebrities and athletes are becoming, or athletes are becoming celebrities. Celebrities are becoming team owners. The lines are so blurry. But one of the things that we usually face questions about is, again, what Peter alluded to before, which is the ROI. People think of it more of as a cost center, whereas the conversation needs to be more about what is the downside of you not doing this? Like, what are you losing out on if you don't implement this? I understand that you have to put a line item and a budget in the budget. And we work with organizations from a strategic consultancy standpoint where we want to work with them in identifying their core KPIs and their objectives and then help implement the right solutions and user journeys against that. But it has to come at some cost. It might be small to begin with, and you can have a crawl, walk, run approach. So cost definitely, and what's the ROI is probably the biggest question. It's, the more case studies that we are able to bring to the table now, that conversation becomes much, much easier because there are others that have sort of led the way and shown how it can be done. But then the other thing I would say is probably there's a lot of noise in the market right now, especially in the sports technology space, which I think is a lot of the audience for today's webinar. There's a lot of noise in the market, and it's always been a buyer's market. It's just increasingly becoming more so now, where there's there's always a cheaper point solution around the corner, and so that creates a lot of attrition for the technology companies that are in the space, because you're always fighting against a no-name brand that you're being asked to bid against in a blind bid of sorts. And so how do you actually, as a tech company that's adding value, how do you capture your share of value is definitely one of the key challenges for people on my side of the on my side of the table. Likewise, people on the other side of the table, a lot of times I've heard this, I don't know how to make a choice. There's so many people, a lot of people are saying the same things. Fan engagement is a catch-all. How do you decide who to work with? Obviously, a lot of organizations have now run the RFP, so someone else has already done their due diligence. So you can piggyback off of that. Every organization doesn't need to do the exact same due diligence every single time. You might have different objectives from other partners, but fundamentally, the underlying technologies, the building blocks don't change that much. It's just how you apply. I like to say that like LiveLike is a set of Lego blocks. Whether you build a mosque or a church is up to you. You choose your religion. But at the end of the day, the building blocks stay the same. Hopefully that answers the question.
And actually, it makes me want to piggyback on, because one of the questions is monetization against fan engagement, right? Because it's easy for us to be here and judging like, oh, it needs to be a long-term strategy, spend some money without being sure of the ROI, nor whether you're going to be in this organization 3 years from now or not. Yeah. But I remember you, Peter, we were having the conversations when you were back at Meta saying, hey, engagement works, social works. We have proof points that that bringing that interactivity actually creates retention. Afterwards, who is better than Meta to monetize their audience? Close to no one. What is the first advice that ties to what Tom was asking in terms of how did you monetize this additional CPM value that you were creating?
Yeah, I think there were definitely challenges at Meta, and there remain challenges in terms of monetization. And I think it's fascinating to see some of the YouTube examples with people like Kaze TV, because Meta fundamentally isn't selling against brands, it's selling against audience. So, for example, when we were showing the Champions League in South America, in theory, we couldn't say to Heineken, yeah, do what you want to do, which is take a load of ad spots against the Champions League. We could say monetize against 18 to 30-year-olds in a certain market who are football fans, and have very targeted advertising, but not really make that connection with a sports brand. I think fascinating to see what YouTube are now increasingly allowing, which is that idea of which Kaze TV in Brazil do brilliantly around the Olympics and FIFA properties, for example, where you can find a way of sponsoring that content and having a brand association that is a more traditional sports sponsorship and sort of fits the requirements of a sponsor better. So I think, yes, there's definitely some monetization on Meta, and there's some small revenue shares there. There's revenue shares on YouTube, so you can find revenue lines out of these networks. But clearly, the long-term potential of understanding your audience and monetizing the audience is far better where you do control the fan data, and you want to say, okay, I've got a fan who's come into a game from Brazil to watch a game in England. He is going to clearly, or she is going to clearly spend more at that game because it's such a one-off moment. I remember a conversation at Arsenal where they were talking about the Emirates Cups, the pre-season friendlies, and they were saying these are the days when we monetize our fans more than anything else, because you're far more likely to have people who come once a season for those pre-season games, as opposed to the people who come in week out, week in, and spend in the same way. So understanding who your audience is, what they're coming from, what their motivations are, is clearly a way of having a much more targeted growth of income.
Yeah,
Just adding to,
go ahead.
no, I mean, Samuel, just specifically, I mean, we talk about this all day long, right? But from a gamification standpoint, advertising is not the only way to monetize, right? Like, I think when you think about gamification and you start thinking about cohorts, I had heard recently an organization saying we don't have a need for a loyalty program because our season ticket member renewal rates are 97%. We don't need loyalty, or it's not we don't need loyalty. The need for loyalty is not as much for this team. And our point over there was it was more about gamification. What we were saying is you maybe 10% of your fan base is season ticket members. That's probably on the higher end as well. The rest of the fans that are more casual fans, that are fans that are coming to your stadium a few times a year, not on a game daily game basis. How do you monetize that fans better? How do you capture a greater share of wallet from those fans? Likewise, there are fans who never come to your stadium, but they are loyal fans. They just may not live in the vicinity. How do you capture a greater share of wallet? That's where strategies like games and gamification truly come into play, is get them to your D2C platforms daily, capture their data, learn more about who they are, and then over time target them with specific packages. So there are many ways to monetize, and gamifications and games and engagement can really lead to that monetization strategy. That's another thing, is like it's not just about advertising revenue anymore. It's not about media rights revenue anymore. There's many other ways to do this.
And I think, going back to one of your earlier questions about how do investors look at properties, they look for growth lines of income. And even if those lines are quite small for now, the idea that you're building growth lines of income that diversify your risk, you're not all about getting one media rights check. I think that's important as you build valuation.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And there's a question coming from Tom Bowers that I'd like to answer, which is how do you ensure that these fan engagement tools are accessible by all clubs and teams with a varying array of budgets and stadium infrastructures? And I would say that is our insights from a tech vendor perspective. Is it's still an emerging space, and there's we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg for the moment. Like what has been done in the sports industry is so behind what other industries have actually developed. So I would say whether it's us, whether it's other organizations in the space, people are willing to over-index if we are able to build good use cases and say, hey, we are looking to help organizations tie that entire journey between on digital platforms, in venue, in stadium, on the jumbotron of the screen. We are looking to work with organizations that have appetite to use the technology well, as much as other organizations who actually want to spend the big dollars that we need, of course, as an organization, as a startup. But I would say don't be shy on asking the vendors. I'm doing a lot because there is appetite in our space currently to build what Peter was just explaining, right? It is because organizations were able to invest on data acquisition that afterwards the targeting element, the segmentation element was the value, and the sales becomes easy versus it is probably very complicated right now for a sales rep in a club to go sell almost exactly the same package as he was selling 10 years ago to a PepsiCo or whatever sponsor they're looking to bring to the table.
There's a lot of questions that are coming in here. I don't think we have the time today to get through all of them, but I'm hoping that we'll find a way to answer those questions. We can obviously reach out to Sam, me, or Peter directly as well. But one question that I did like, which is actually maybe Peter, you might have a good good way to answer is what are the main differences? It's from Lars Kaiser. What are the main differences that on one side leagues with a permanent all year round product, and on the other side, major global events like Olympics and FIFA World Cup that happen once every few years face when looking into gamification and building loyalty with their fan base?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it clearly is a different tactic, right? And I love what FIFA have tried to do with FIFA Plus, and Olympics have clearly tried to have a more year-round presence with things like the Olympic Channel. But fundamentally, you're going to get a massive amount of people come in and care a lot at the time of that big event, and turning that into a loyalty program is a different sort of challenge. But that intense activity of 2 weeks or a month's activity, is still long enough to build something that becomes a habit daily or multiple times a day. And I think that sense of I'm using my time sensibly because I'm progressing up a leaderboard, I'm getting some rewards, I'm getting some benefit out of this time I'm spending, I think helps justify people to watch longer and to care more. And that, therefore, though the challenge and the mechanics of a year-round event compared to a short-term event is very different, your fundamental ability to do something with that audience is still there. And I think, again, give them something that allows them to authentically feel like they're part of the event and they're creating as part of the event. That one of the great strands, I think, of content over the next few years is going to be seeing fans create more, using assets that leagues and teams give them to create their own content, seeing athletes publish more. So the sort of huge breadth of publishing content is going to get even bigger and bigger. Your challenge as a league and team is putting an umbrella over that and saying, okay, how do we capture that data and find a way of monetizing that data? And again, I stress that for me, you work with your players. It's not just about team accounts or league accounts. It's trying to bring the players into that structure as well. They are your biggest emotional hook. So hopefully they can feed into this for you.
Actually, I'll just add a couple more things. We work with partners like Tomorrow Golf League, Live Golf, even other leagues that have started recently where their seasons are shortened, right? It's not just about the global tournaments. Even those organizations, they have, like Tomorrow Golf League is only from Jan to April. How do you keep the audience's attention during the rest of the time? Well, those athletes are also competing in other tournaments. In fact, that's the perfect way to get to tell us more about you. Which athletes do you follow? Are you a Rory fan? Are you a Tiger fan? So the next time when they're competing in other places or other tournaments, you can still come to us to talk about that fandom. And Peter, you mentioned how you let athletes accounts become an avenue for fan engagement. Organizations like Bleacher Report lean into UGC content, right, where users are coming in and posting. I mean, that's what Reddit is all about, obviously, and it's been there for 20 years. But come in and talk about what happens during the off season of Formula One is indicative of what these organizations should be doing as well. Giving your audiences a chance to engage with your athletes, whether they're playing during those months or not. USOPC does the same thing. They're running quizzes, they're running polls about all their different athletes, and there's hundreds, thousands of them, right, across all the different disciplines, sports disciplines, or even simple stuff like follow an athlete's health and wellness routine. How are they prepping? How are they getting ready for the big tournament? People want to engage. I think what Instagram and TikTok and all of these organizations have shown us is people want to engage with these athletes even when they're not on the field. They want to learn more about them. And so leaning into that fandom or that behavior is something that can only happen if you actually invest in the foundations of a D2C or your own digital properties, capturing a CRM, capturing that database, and then reaching out to those fans when hey, do you want to engage with your favorite athlete? What is their routine, etc. So I think learning from that is an important part of fan engagement.
maybe we have just one last question to wrap it up, because it's a pretty good one from John as well. So we're talking about the complexity of how to engage people on a platform outside of the live events, right? But how fundamental it is and how there are opportunities for it. Peter, and with your broadcaster head up, like being on the broadcast side of things not so long ago, how important do you think that experience is for people to keep subscribing to platforms compared to going to consume content illegally? Do you think that there's a strong tie there, or do you think that it's the correlation is not that big between both topics?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about teams and leagues and needing to sort of build and keep their audiences. It's the same challenge for a broadcaster, and particularly to be part of that official broadcast as opposed to being part of an illegal broadcast. I think is a really good challenge. And whether that be second screen experiences or whether it be being an immersive broadcast, I think there are opportunities there to offer some added value that isn't just available to a pirated stream. So if you can try and build that engagement with a fan, hopefully it keeps them off the illegals and gives a reason to be part of an official process. One of the things that I love about the immersive stuff is the fact you've got the chance of watching it with like unlimited graphics alongside the live broadcast. And that means you've got a way of fans leaning in and doing things during the game as opposed to just receiving the game. And that can't be offered by an illegal in the same way. So that I think is part of the story. But also if you've got branded immersive or gaming elements built into your broadcast, the value of that sponsorship is not just on your official viewers, but it's also for your illegal viewers. So
Yeah.
I think you look at some of the work that's been done by, again, NBA around illegal viewing of their content, but actually putting it in their sponsorship values. I think that's a fascinating route that will become more and more important.
Awesome. We could go on for a long time. This is fascinating. There's so many follow-up questions that even I have based on our responses, but I think we'll have to wrap it up. It's been awesome. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. As I said to the audience before, please feel free to get in touch over LinkedIn or DM if you have any more questions. But I appreciate everyone joining us and for sending in the questions as well.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.